message and to talk about the wise men. But before I do, I'd like to talk to you about something else, and that is gravity. How many of you heard of it? How many of you are well acquainted with it? Yeah. Here we go. Okay, gravity, according to scientists, is one of four basic forces that hold the universe together. The other three forces are there's a strong and a weak force that only have to do with subatomic levels, and I don't have any idea what that is. There's a third one, which is electromagnetism, which gets our watches running and our televisions on. That's all I know about it. And the fourth one is gravity. Now, the thing about gravity that's so interesting is that it is the weakest of the four basic forces. It is the power that all things have to be attracted to everything else. All matter is attracted to every other matter in the universe, which means that you're attractive whether you think you are or not. And if you think you're very attractive, I'm sorry to break this, but you're not very attractive because gravity is not that strong. But when you're dealing with something massive and huge, like the Earth, gravity is very, very powerful. And it extends for a long period of time, a long distance, I mean. Now, gravity is what pulls the moon to the earth. But why doesn't the moon crash into the earth? Well, the reason it doesn't crash into the earth is because gravity, being essentially a very weak force, it does not pull it all the way. There are other forces that are also working on the moon, especially in short distances. And so what happens is gravity pulls it down, and velocity, centrifugal force, and other things keep it moving. And so the result of that is that the moon revolves around the earth and continues to revolve around the earth. Now, if the moon should slow down, what would happen? It would fall. It would come to earth, right? If the moon should suddenly speed up, what would happen? It would go off into a higher orbit. Now, the reason I'm talking about gravity is because I want you to understand the analogy that God's love is like gravity. God's love is an attractive force that causes God to be attracted to every one of you. And God has placed in you a piece of him that is attracted to him. There is a natural desire in all of us to come close to the heart of God. And God has a great desire to pull us to him. So we can change it to look like this, that the heart of God is attracting you whether you know it or not. He's pulling you to him. He's pulling all people to him. But just like we find in the earth and the moon, there are forces that keep us from coming any closer to God than we are. Now, as the love of God pulls us to him, things such as personal stress in your life, your own personal velocity, all that stress, all that speeding up that you do, especially at Christmas time, you get so involved doing this or that you really don't have time to think about God. Fear, I want to be close to God, but I don't know if I want to be that close. I don't know how it's going to change me. Sin, the things that we're doing in our life that are wrong. Satan is a real force that's pulling us away from God. Outside pressure, the pressure of the world. All these things pull us away from God so that God's call on our life does not pull us all the way. All these other things fight against it. So there's a war going on in our heart right now. And the war is between the love of God, which is pulling us to him, and all of these other things in our life which are distracting us, which are keeping us away. What happens in your spiritual life if you start to slow down and you stop running as fast as you are to do all the daily stresses? Well, what happens is that you start pulling closer to God. But what happens if you allow sin and Satan and all the stresses of life? If your stresses speed up and you stop thinking about them, what happens? You begin to move away from God. Now, what we see in this passage and what we're going to see in a moment is God's gravity attracting people, someone, to God, and what that means. And he's attracting you too, but we have to be willing to overcome our fears, to overcome our personal velocity, and we have to start listening to his voice. Now, in this story, we're going to see a person who does that. But before I do, I wanted to share one other thing with you. James Martin is a Jesuit writer, and he talks about the journey that we have to God, that we're all on a journey that can bring us close to God. And in that journey, he says there are basically three paths that we travel. The first one of those is the path of faith. He said that simply just means that you believe what you were taught as a child. You were taught to believe in Jesus as a child. You were taught to come to him and worship as a child. And that is a simple path. This is the path of Mary and Joseph. Mary was a virgin. God comes to her and says, "Hail, blessed one, the Lord is with thee." And she just says, "Okay, be it done to me according to your wish." She simply believes. But the second path is the path of exploration. And the path of exploration is what happens in your life when you've discovered that there are certain things in your life that you believed about God or maybe didn't believe about God, and you find out that they're wrong. Disillusionment is an important part of your spiritual walk, because disillusionment simply means that, to take the illusions away and to be able to see the true God. We come to a point in our life where we realize that what we've been doing is not working. And so we have to reach out and explore something different. And that can be scary. That can be very scary. And it can be dangerous. But that's the only way. The path of the Magi, the ones that we're talking about today, are on that path. Just to round it out, the third of this path was the path of return, and that was the path of the prodigal son. That's where we get out and we explore, and we discover that that where we went was not right, and we say, "I will return to my Father," and that path too. By every path and every way, God is drawing us to him. God is all around us, he is with us, and he wants to have fellowship with us. Sometimes I've had people ask me the question, "How can I find God?" And I tell them, you don't have to. That's like being a person who starts out on a little rowboat on Lake Michigan to look for fresh water. God is all around us. God is in everything, and everywhere that we look, God puts signposts, messages that can lead us to him if we have the faith to believe in that. And that brings us to the story that we're going to be talking about today, which is the story of the Wisemen. Okay, let's read Matthew 2, 1 and 2. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we have observed his star at his rising, and we have come to pay homage." This is, of course, the famous story of the wise men. Now, let me get some things out of the way before I talk about these men. Many of the myths that we believe about them. Contrary to the song we just sang, they were not kings. Nowhere in the Bible does it say they were kings. And it doesn't say there were three of them. That came from old medieval plays where they had people representing the king, and they had to have three of them because they had three different gifts. So that was where that came from. There's nothing in the Bible that indicates there were three of them. Their names were not Melchior, Gaspar, and Balthazar. In fact, there's one 6th century manuscript that was recently found that suggested that there might be 24 of those kings. We have no idea how many. There could have been 2, 50. We have no idea how many there were. The third thing that I want to get out of the way is the idea that they arrived on the night Jesus was born, and that they were there at the manger. The Bible never says that. In fact, it indicates quite the opposite. In Matthew, when they arrive at the Christ child, it mentions that they were in a house. They were not in a manger, so this was sometimes later. And the word in Greek they use is not the word for an infant, a baby, but the word for a small child, say like a toddler. So we're talking about them arriving sometime afterwards. But the one thing that we can know for sure about them is that they were magi. So let me talk just a moment about who they were. The Magi were priests of a religion called Zoroastrianism. Still around today. They're called Parsis today, but the Zoroastrians were started sometime around 500 BC, about the same time as the Babylonian captivity. And although they are a false religion, they have some things in common with Judaism and Christianity. And one of the things that they had in common was a belief in angels. But their belief in angels was kind of weird. They believed that every star you see in the sky is literally an angel. All those little lights up in the sky, they believed that angels, that they've been somehow fixed up there. They also believed that there were certain angels that weren't fixed, but that wandered around through the sky. In Greek, these are called planets. They watched these planets, and they believed that by their dance in the sky, they could tell what God was going to do on earth. They had that belief. So they were the first people to believe in and develop the what we call the pseudoscience of astrology. They were the first astrologer. Our zodiac came from the Magi, as the word magician and magic came from those same names. These people believed they could read the signs in the heaven and tell what was happening on earth. Now, we know that this is nonsense. In fact, the Bible very specifically says, don't study it. Stay away from it. Nevertheless, God has this way of using wherever we are and in whatever belief, whether they be false or not, as guideposts and signposts to point us to Him. Remember, God's gravity is drawing us closer to Him, and as He does, He uses whatever He can to bring us close to Him. And in this case, He used their belief in astrology. So they saw something in the sky. What they saw in the sky, we have no idea. Some have suggested it was a comet. Some have suggested that what they saw was a supernova that no longer exists. Tycho Brahe, I think it was, came up with the idea that what they saw was the conjunction of three planets in the part of the skies that represented Judea, and that was what prompted them on this journey. Whatever it was, we have no idea what it was. But to them, it was real. And so these men decided that they were going to go off and find out what God was doing. Okay, let's stop it right here, just for a moment. Do you think that these were the only magi in Persia? They were not. There must have been hundreds, even thousands of these magi that studied the sky just like these guys did. But these men were the only ones to go out and actually find out what was going on. All the other magi stayed in Persia. Why? Well, let's talk about that. This is a map of the world, or part of the world at that time. You see that big part that says Parthian Empire? That's the kingdom of Persia. You see the other part that says the Roman Empire? That's part of where that was the Roman Empire. And we know that Jerusalem is there. And that's where the star told them to go. They are here. Now that journey, depending on what part of the Parthian Empire they're in, could have taken anywhere between 6 months to 18 months one way to make it. 6 to 18 months, just one way. So 1 to 3 years of their life they are going to devote to finding out what that star is all about. Now, it's not just as simple as we think. It's not just field and forest, vale and mountain following yonder star. There were 2 mountain ranges, one of them the foothills of the Himalayas, that they had to cross to get there. There were also 3 deserts that they had to cross in that 1 to 3 year trip. But that wasn't the bad part. The bad part was what was right in the middle, which is the border between the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire. The Roman Empire and the Parthians were the only people strong enough to beat the Romans in battle. And they fought for 300 years over that piece of land. The other group to the north of that, which I didn't label, is called the Scythians, and they used to raid down into that same area. So this was one dangerous place, possibly the most dangerous place from a battle perspective that they could possibly go through, that they had to cross to get there to see what was going on with that star. Now let me put it into some perspective for you. Let's say that I told you today that the Christ child was to be born. And I suggested to you that we ought to get a group of people together to greet the Christ child when he was born. And there's no doubt he's going to be born. And how many of you would go on such a journey to see the Christ child born? How many would do it? Would you buy your ticket today? Let's see, how many would do it? Okay, now there's one trick I didn't tell you is that he's going to be born in North Korea. How many of you? You see the problem? These men were not just taking a trip. They were risking their lives to be there. God calls us to Him like gravity, pulls us to Him. And we desire his heart, but we cannot overcome sometimes our fears, our worries, our trepidations. They seem to live with us, and when they do, they ruin it for us. They keep us from going away. Martin Luther, in that monastery in Germany, was reading one day in the book of Romans, Romans 3:8, where it says, the just will live by faith. And when he read it, it was like a star to him. All of a sudden it went off. Yes, that's how I get salvation. The just will live by faith. And he followed that star, and he followed it, even though it led him out of the monastery and eventually out of the Catholic Church into a place where he was almost killed. I've wondered how many other monks, probably reading the same message the same night, read the just will live by faith and understood that it meant what it meant and said, I just don't want to go there. I just don't want to think about it because it's going to upset my life too much. See, God is calling us, but if God is going to call us, we have to be willing to take the journey. These guys were. Okay, let's take them on that journey. After they came to Jerusalem, they naturally decided that they would go to the king of Jerusalem at the time, who is this guy, Herod the Great. Of all the people in the world that they could have visited that day, that was probably the worst guy to tell that to. Let me tell you a little bit about Herod the Great. Herod the Great was a good friend of Pompey Caesar, who was the man who conquered that area for the Roman Empire. Herod the Great was powerful. He was a tremendous builder. He was very charismatic. He was very authoritarian, and he was also a paranoid megalomaniac, if there ever was one. He was crazy with jealousy for his throne. He built a system of fortresses all around Jerusalem and Israel. Masada is one of those, if you ever go to Israel. And when you go to those fortresses, you realize that the purpose of those fortresses was not to defend his country, but to defend him personally. If somebody tried to overthrow him, he could run to any of those and protect himself, and nobody could take him, and that was the whole point of it. He was crazy to keep his king. And so they come up to him and say, where is the new king to be born? Oh, I'm sure he loved that. So Herod calls together not his advisors. Herod is an Idumean. He's not even a Jew. But he calls together the religious leaders of Jerusalem. And here's what he says. He said, when Herod heard this, he was frightened. And all Jerusalem with him. You can imagine what he could have done to people if there was a new king. It was a civil war. And calling together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them, where is the Messiah to be born? And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet. And this is the passage that you heard earlier. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For you shall come as a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel. Okay, let's stop it right there and think about something. Who did he call? Chief priests, scribes, the leaders of the Jewish faith at the time. And they had no hesitation of knowing where Jesus was to be born. They knew exactly where Jesus was to be born. He's to be born in Bethlehem, which is only 4 to 6 miles away from Jerusalem. That's all. When he calls all these people together, and he tells them this, the question that I had in my mind was, they had one job, to look for the Messiah. That was the most important thing that the Jewish leaders had done. Every Passover, they got together and they prayed for the Messiah to come. They desperately, and all through, they followed all kinds of false messiahs in these days. They were looking for the Messiah. And it dawned on me when I was reading this, you mean they could not put a guy to wait in Bethlehem? I mean, think about it. 4 to 6 miles. That's closer than I am to the church. That's Mineral Springs. That's Weddington. That's Stallings. It's within that thing. I walk my dog at night, and sometimes we go 4 miles. It takes us about an hour and 20 minutes on foot. Now, you can imagine in this time, it takes 1 to 2 hours to go from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, and they can't put somebody there? Really? Now remember, this is after Jesus is already born. And this is after the shepherds had appeared in the hillsides to the the angels had appeared in the hillsides to the shepherds. And this is after the shepherds were running up and down through Bethlehem saying, the king is born, the Messiah is born. And they couldn't send somebody down there to look. What's wrong with these people? And when they come, here we go. This is Jerusalem. This is Bethlehem, 4 to 6 miles. That's it. That's an hour on a horse. Why did they not go? And why were they not already there? I'll tell you why. Because we want to get just so close to God, but not too close. We want to look for him. But what happens when we start getting closer? Things change. These men did not want to find out. That's why. And when these pagans come from someplace else to find Jesus, why don't they say, well, we'll go with you? Not one of them says, we'll go with you. Why? Because sometimes we like our religion comfortable and easy and non-challenging. I was talking to a guy recently, and we were talking about Brother Lawrence's book, Practice of the Presence of God. Anybody ever read it? It's a great book. Brother Lawrence makes the point. He said we want to live in our life in a way that we have daily a sense of the presence of God in all things that we do in our life. And this guy was telling me, he said, I don't know if I want that. He said, because if I lived in my life in a way that Christ was with me at all times and I was with Christ at all times, if I had that kind of intimacy or union, he said, people would think I'm weird. Have you ever thought that? People would think I'm weird. There's two answers for that. One of them is that when Christ enters your life and he enters all parts of your life, it doesn't necessarily mean he changes your life so much as that everything you do, he's with you. He's always with you. You're not changing necessarily what you do. You're just living with a new sense of intimacy. And the other thing that occurred to me when he said it is what is weird anyway? What's normal? Isn't it normal to be with Christ? Just because everybody else isn't there doesn't make you weird. It makes them weird. Christ is the center. Do we want to go? Well, they weren't sure, but the wise men, the Magi, were. Because it says this next. It says, when they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went a star that they had seen at its rising, the star that they'd seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they stopped at the star and saw the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. The wise men took that little 1 to 2 hour trip down to Bethlehem. And when they got there, of course, they didn't know where to go, but the star led them. And I don't have any idea how he did that. It's sort of God's GPS, shows them exactly the place to go, and they go there. And when they go there, imagine them standing outside of the door of that little cottage. Just picture it. Their hands up, ready to knock on the door. What would you be feeling if you were one of those wise men? You just come 2 years, maybe a year, 2.5. How long? And you're there, you're into the journey. The king is inside, the King of Kings, and you're about to knock on the door and meet him. What are you going to be feeling? In order to picture that, I started thinking about things in my life that was similar to that. And one of the things I thought about was the night before I was married. Do any of you men remember the night before you were married? Or women, do you remember how that feels? You're excited, you're really wanting to go, you're wanting to knock on the door, you're really wanting this next stage in your life, but you go, but what's going to happen afterwards? I'm going to have somebody that I'm responsible for, and I really want this? That's why they throw bachelor parties, is sort of to say goodbye to this old world, and now you're there, and some guys get cold feet and run at that point. Or I think about what it was like when my wife and I had our first child. And my wife is in delivery, and I'm thinking to myself, what have I gotten myself into? Braces, school, fighting off boyfriends, all of this is before me. Can I take it? And I'm not so sure. I'm excited, I want it, but I don't want it. Well, what happens when they knock on that door and they encounter Christ face to face? They're going to meet the King of Kings. Are they ready? And they knock on the door. And what happens? On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. And opening their treasure chest, they offered him gold and frankincense and myrrh. What a wonderful, wonderful, they greeted him with everything they had. Well, that's what happens when we meet Christ. It's scary. It's scary to go deeper with the Lord. It is. But when you do, it's worth it. When a man gets married, and all of that cold feet, all that stuff disappears about the second day of his honeymoon. He doesn't care about that anymore. He's just having too good of a time. When a baby is born and you hold that little child in your arms, you're not sitting there thinking about all the things that could have gone wrong. You're just delighted that you're there. You realize in the joy of that coming together, there is great blessing. When we come to Christ, and we meet him, we go like the Wisemen did to that place. There is a great joy. Because you see, God is reaching out to you. He's drawing to you there like gravity. Not to hurt you, not to judge you, but to rejoice with you. I think about the whole situation as if I were a young girl at a dance, my first dance. You have to use your imagination to think of me as a young girl, I know, but try. If you're a lady, you can think of yourself as that young girl. Maybe 13, 14 years old, thinking you're ugly, thinking nobody will ever have you. You come to the dance with your friends, and you sit there in the wallflower corner, drinking punch, thinking, oh, nobody's going to talk to me. And the handsomest guy at the dance walks over to you and says, I've had my eye on you. Will you join me in a dance? And you just turn so beet red. Ooh, it's so scary. You don't know what to do. You go, oh, I can't. I really can't dance. And he goes, come, may I have this dance? And you look at him and say, I can't dance. I'm a Lutheran. I don't dance. But you take her hand. She takes his hand. He holds her in his arms, and they glide across the floor. And it's beautiful. Christ is extending his hand to you. He's offering you the chance. May I have this dance? Don't be afraid to say yes. And follow the star that God has set in your life. Follow it all the way to the manger and to the cross. Amen? Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this opportunity to relive again that great and risky moment that you were born upon this earth. And help us, dear Father, to rejoice in the invitation you have given us at Christmas. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.